Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Thought Leaders. I'm your host Chris Shang, and I'm glad to have Tamsen Webster today, who's joining us from Message Design Institute. Thank you so much for being a part of this.
I am delighted. Thanks so much for having me.
Of course, you have a very extensive background that we're going to dive into, but let's talk about the present. What is Message Design Institute? What are you guys doing? What kind of companies, what kind of individuals are you guys working
Yep.
with?
So the Message Design Institute is really a brand new thing that I am launching and have launched this year. It is designed to teach people the art and science of persuasive message design so that they can design those messages on their own if they so choose, and without necessarily having to go to any expensive outside consultants or agencies, et cetera. We typically are working with folks that are trying to create some level of change, whether that's at the organizational level, team level, but sometimes market and even society level. And generally what we're doing is we are, through those skills, either learning to do it on their own or working one-on-one with leaders and companies to craft their cases for change.
Got it. Particular industries or like size of companies that you tend to work with?
So well, given the background of that I've been in, there's a lot, but generally the folks that I tend to work with or have tended to work with to date, on the corporate side, that's essentially been fairly large companies, I'd say 1,000 plus, but really I think the distinctive combination there is that they tend to be challenger brands. They tend to be representing some shift in thinking or approach in the marketplace, and therefore they're trying to create some level of change. The other place where I spend a lot of my work is with typically impact focused B2B startups.
Mm.
So a lot of folks in the green and clean energy space, in regenerative agriculture, in decarbonization, et cetera. Again, because they are putting something new and novel into the marketplace. And so that they're really in this position of how do we get people to understand and adopt new ideas?
Awesome. Um, Very cool. I would love to dive a little bit more deeper around what you're currently working on, but before we get there, always like to talk about the origination story. So I saw that you spent a lot of time marketing, communications.
Yep.
So what led into that space? Obviously, it seems like this is kind of coming full circle with just things that are inherently a part of your nature, but how did you discover, your initial chapter of your career in terms of like that being a profession that you were going to get into? Was it something that you always anticipated that was a good, organic match, or was it something you engineered?
Well, I mean, I think that my attempt when I was choosing what to study in school, I mean, I did study marketing, market research as an undergrad, and then added organizational behavior and management communications with my MBA. And so, but I started in marketing because in my mind that was the creative form of business. So I wanted to have a business degree because I wanted to be employable. But I also actually, both in undergrad and grad, got a liberal arts degree at the same time. So I was trying to get the best of both worlds. And once I had the marketing piece, it seemed to me to make intuitive sense that there was no way a marketing campaign that was going to go outside of the organization was going to be successful if there wasn't true support for it on the inside, which is why I was really interested in marketing communications. And then I had a brief but enduring turn as a change management consultant where a lot of that comes all together. So that's, now we're talking about organization, we're talking about change within the organization or between two organizations. Um, and just over time, I found that my skill set was in and interest really was in the words. Not because I was any kind of writer or anything like that. It's just, again, it just made sense to me that it's the words that have to carry both the idea and the understanding and the acceptance of these new ideas. And so I just really, from an early point in my career, was just really interested in, like, well, how do we find the power of an idea? How do we articulate it? What does the other side need to hear? What works best? And how can I make it easier to help other people make a transformational change?
Interesting. I want to come back to that, but you mentioned that, when you got into studying marketing, it was like the creative aspect of business. Um, What do you mean by, I guess, what do you mean by that? Because I think about that too. I remember like when
Hmm.
was, I never thought I would be doing what I'm doing now, but I think of advertising when I was like in my early 20s, and I
Hmm.
was like, oh, that's the creative space where you get to draw and you get to pitch and you get to come up with something creative.
Yeah.
And that kind of appealed to some of the things that I was really more passionate about, from like an artistic standpoint.
Yeah.
I don't know if you had any of that kind of similarity in terms of like, you really enjoyed writing or drawing or painting or creating something and then bridge that.
Yeah, I mean, I was an arts kid in school, though I was also the manager of the varsity boys baseball team. So I've always led this kind of dual interests, right?
Yep.
Or seemingly opposing interests. But very much, yeah, I sang, I was a vocalist in through college. I loved art. I was terrible at it. I hated writing and I won awards in it. Um, so when like I said, when I went to go into business school and I was choosing like which aspect of it, yeah, it was really trying to balance out. And they're in the early 90s, like, 30 recessions ago. Um, like what would keep me employed? Because at that point, it was not a great job market. And so, yeah, I mean, I was trying to keep that interest alive, but I wasn't interested as much in kind of advertising and that kind of thing because I was always interested much more in the kind of the strategic, organizational piece. Like what are those longer term, those less changeable aspects of organizations. And I think to some extent it's because, I went in to undergrad and even grad school thinking that I wanted to work in museums because,
Mm.
who doesn't? Doctor, lawyer, art museum director. Um, and I think that influenced it as well because I was thinking much more institutionally
Yep. Yep.
and wanting to be in leadership and I'm sure that happens that people get to tops of organizations from an advertising background, but that didn't seem as likely to me.
Yep.
So that's how I
No,
ended up. Yeah, that's what I think that I mean, who knows? That's the story I'm telling myself about why I ended up that way.
fair enough. Um, that said, obviously, I think you spent a significant amount of time learning the, the hard skills ultimately of the craft and specifically marketing communications, and I'm sure taking philosophies and the more maybe academic knowledge base that you need to have as table stakes. But once you elevate, right, and start becoming more of a leader in a space, one of the common themes that I see here is like there's a different adjustment or evolution of a soft skill set that's required
Hmm.
that either hits as an epiphany moment
Yeah.
or comes with the age or maturing of you professionally. Um, but what were some of those things? Because a lot of that now just becomes like, when you're dealing with teams and you're dealing with organizations, it's about the way that you communicate what it is that you're trying to get them to execute on. And it could be at the end of the day, the same exact thing that you want somebody to do, but you have to figure out the 5 or 10 different ways to communicate that exact same thing so everybody's bought into the exact same thing.
You got it. You got it.
So, so would love to kind of get your thoughts of when that moment happened. Maybe perhaps maybe a little bit more intrinsic to the profession of what you're in.
Yeah.
And maybe that's just already something that started off very quickly. But like, was there a moment when you kind of like starting to make the adjustment to either like the leadership part or the entrepreneurial part or the
Hmm.
speaker part that it started to kind of like click in even further?
Yeah, I mean, I think I can look and say that there are certain like big moments where there were different evolutions of that. I mean, and it started really, coming as a change management consultant, right? Here was this idea of a change, and you could see that the leaders had reasons for it, but they weren't necessarily the reasons that would resonate strongly with the people who they were asking to change. So that was one of the pieces. And actually, when I was in my role as change management, I was tasked with coming up with the first curriculum or first approach for that particular consulting company for change communications. And I don't really feel like I've ever not been in change communications ever since. But then when I went after that, I went to work in an art museum, and then I was looking at, well, okay, we've got what the organization is about, but then, so now we've got a couple different groups of folks that we need to pay attention, and we need to interpret that big idea of the museum to different people. So that there's people who give money to the museum, and we need to talk to them about certain things and in certain ways. And then there are people who we want to come attend the museum. And then there's internal communication. So again, it's starting to say, okay, well, what is this idea? And one of the things that I noticed in that job was that was so interesting because they brought in 3 different branding agencies, and the director wasn't happy with any of them, and eventually just took it inside and didn't come up with necessarily a better result at that point. But I was like, I wonder why they failed. Like, I wonder why that failed. I went from there to performing arts college, and so that added another layer, because now there was kind of this layer of adding to the audience development and donor communications and general marketing. Now there was admissions, like how do you speak to potential students, and indirectly, how do you speak to their parents and guardians, because it's really, and a lot of times those are the folks making some of those decisions. So I mean, I can keep going on like that, where even when I jumped the fence and went towards to agencies, I just kept looking at what was not working, either about the typical brand strategy, brand identity that more often than not failed. Or then when social media started up, it's like, well, even if you have a somewhat successful brand, you can't just keep saying a tagline every day in social. So like, how do you, like, what's the bridge? What's the connection between some idea of a brand and concepts, content, whatever that actually brings that to life? So I think that it's just been a series of, I mean, so I think the other big one was, just to back up a little bit, is for most of those positions, I was the one that was doing and figuring out the messaging and needing to adjust it myself. And then when I started my moonlighting job as the executive producer and then as idea strategist for TEDxCambridge, which is now TEDxNewEngland, um, suddenly I couldn't tell them what to say, right? They needed to figure out what to say. So that was really one of the first big shifts of now saying, okay, well, what is it that I do, and how can I reverse engineer this process that has become intuitive for me into something that someone else can follow? And that's really where my red thread methodology came about, because it was saying, okay, if you structure content this way, even if you structure your understanding of your idea this way, you're going to be able to explain it a lot better, and you're going to have the raw materials that will allow you to shift it. So I think it just came from, I think, as many things do, trying to solve the issues that I saw from, in my own work. And then once I was an opportunity to help other people solve that, to figure out, how do I formalize that? How do I turn it into a process or a workable model so that people could do it themselves?
Got it. And is that taking you then full circle to now with Message Design Institute?
Yeah, exactly. And so what the Message Design Institute is all about, since I've spent the last 8 years, so I decided to go out on my own about 8 years ago. It's 8 years as of June. And I did that because, the job where I was before, I literally thought was going to be my last job. I loved it. It was sales messaging. It was kind of a boutique sales messaging design firm. We taught kind of presentation skills. And I was like, oh, this is great. I love it. And I was always very interested in working with the startups and with the individuals and those kinds of folks, because they had like the new, really different ideas. And I had also started moonlighting at TEDxCambridge at that point. And the head of the company, they wanted to move forward with these things, but we didn't agree on what like equity and ownership of any ideas would be. So, and because I was much more interested in individual and startup coaching, and that's not where they wanted to go, I split off and then developed my own stuff. Um, so yeah, I mean, the last 8 years I've really spent on figuring out models, processes, templates, worksheets, to help people fill in those gaps that I think that traditional marketing, communication, sales, persuasion, influence, teaching, if it's there at all, doesn't cover. And, so there's a lot of stuff about here's the message, let's just put it out there. But I don't think it really addresses the not just the why behind what you're doing, but the why behind how you're doing it. And so that's what the Message Design Institute is meant to be, so that it doesn't have to be, people don't have to go out of their organization or even outside of themselves. They can get a really solid head start on what I consider to be a core life and business skill, on their own, but not alone, as I like to say.
Yep, absolutely. Um, on that note, I also had another quick question around, uh, when you decided to go out on your own 8 years ago, there's also a different, there's a different set of hats that you're going to be wearing, and it's a multitude of them. You're going to pick up skill sets that you never thought you're going to learn before. You're going to have to learn how to at least have some basic understanding of legal terminology,
Yeah.
how to manage books and things like that. But has there been anything along the way as an entrepreneur now that you've picked up that you've either loved or hated, either leaned into, or just kind of like, this, I have to do this, but I'm not, this is not for me.
Oh yeah, operations. I mean, and I mean that's become more and more clear over time. And I think the other thing that's become more and more clear over time is I don't think when we start that we spend enough time. I know I didn't, so maybe I shouldn't generalize. Really understanding the basic options of business model. And I think that I went in thinking that the only way I could do what I could do was as a services, coaching, consulting based business model. Um, and that model is difficult to scale, because there's only one of me. But it's also kind of emotionally exhausting, not just because you're the one doing, you know, like all the work, but you're also the one creating all the IP, and you're also the one doing a lot of the, marketing stuff. And I got really good advice on how to scale a services based business, but it was really at the end of last year where I had a conversation with a friend of mine who had sold his services based business to create a learning, education, training one, that I was like, oh, that's that's way more what I would like to be doing. And so I say that I wish I had known that, but I don't know that even 3 years ago I would have said, yeah, let me turn this into that kind of business. I think it took me having to essentially reach a rock bottom of sorts with a services based business to go, okay, there's elements that I like there. I'm going to choose to keep those elements, but I do not want the main source of revenue to be resting so squarely on my shoulders. So I think that's kind of both of those things. And then once I had that clarity, and I also started a doctoral program this summer, and so that's provided even more clarity that what I love to do is to come up with is to understand the problems that are out there as far as message design and persuasive communication go, and then kind of gather all my resources and synthesize, and then figure out a potentially better way to solve for them, test that out, and then release them into the world as things that other people can use. Which is why, while I am de facto CEO of MDI, like I don't want to be for very long. And that's why I'm kind of focusing on being the chief learning officer, because that's what I'm trying to manifest into existence. Not much of a manifester, but just as a reminder to myself that that's what I want to be doing, so that I can get the resources and the people and the systems in place that would allow me to really focus there. Because that's what I discovered, after 8 years, that it's like, this is my favorite part.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's like I've met a lot of founders that have gone through that route where, it starts off in a service-based capacity, and then they hit that wall, which is like, or it's not a wall, it's sometimes just a realization is like, either one, it's like, it's not scalable, and that's a tough realization. And then like,
Yep.
again, your cash flow is depending upon you as kind of
Yep.
like selling yourself, right? And so it's
Yes.
like, So that anxiety of like, if I lose one, or I have to have a buffer of like how many clients and all that kind of stuff. And so you're like switching between execution and business development, and that can be somewhat draining. I think that's like probably the most emotional draining part of it,
Yeah.
is like managing business development with execution. Um, but that makes a lot of sense. So we'd love to kind of like get a better understanding. You kind of have been alluding to this with focusing on the chief learning officer role.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Because it's still very brand new. Like, what does
Yes.
that product look like in the next 6 months or a year? And where are you hoping that it gets to? And how are you getting the feedback loop to iterate on the product that is actually scalable?
All excellent, thought-provoking questions. All right. So the last piece, I'll answer the last one first,
Sure.
which is I
Yeah.
have worked with an experienced business model designer. Thank goodness those exist. Who's done this multiple times, right? And thankfully, between her and the woman who designs my website, who also has a lot of experience with, particularly with course training, learning community type businesses online. Both of them are kind of giving feedback of like, here's what we've seen work. And then that combined with my own knowledge at this point of myself and what I like to do, and learning theory, thanks to my doctoral program, that it's kind of saying, okay, well, here's how I kind of want here's how I'd like to start it out and see what happens from there. So the see what happens, I think some of the feedback is just going to be how much traction do we get on certain of these things? Do people follow through? We know how we're planning it, thinking that the paths through are going to look like, this or that, and I'll talk about those. But I think the at least in the beginning is that happening, and to what extent is that happening? Um, and um, and just this is probably horrifying to any number of people out there, but it's like I've done so much in my career from like gut and instinct. I'm like, yes, I'm big on data and research and studies, but when it really comes to what is right for me, my business, and what I'm trying to do with my intellectual property, there have been a lot of times where I have gone absolutely counter to conventional wisdom, because it was what felt right to me. It felt right to, the folks that you know, based on kind of just you know, synthesis of patterns of information, right? Not totally gut. Um, but that's kind of where I am with this too. It's just like I want to set it up in such a way. Let's see what happens. I'm good with tweaking it once we get it rolling. But here, I'm fairly clear on how I want it to start and what some of my ideas are about where I want it to go.
Got it. Got it. Um, Interesting. And I guess like from just as we're rounding up on time here, kind of last few thoughts would be, is this the last is like message design institute, is
This
that
is
going
my
to
last act. I don't think so.
be
Yeah. I
or is
mean,
it?
so go ahead.
No, I mean, I feel like because every one of these things is like it takes a lot of energy, right?
Yeah. Yes, it
It,
does. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I think like I've spoken to founders who's gone through multiple iterations of starting different types of businesses, and some of them get to a point in that trajectory where it's like this is kind of the last, yeah, this is the last thing. I don't know if you've ever thought about that, or it's like there, or or if you have other versions of
Yeah.
that
I
you're
mean, yeah, no,
uh,
I mean, I have been deeply curious in the process of transformational change since I was 17. I mean, because that's when I had my first ER bad enough panic attack. And so ever since then, I've been like, how do we change these things? And how do we change these things for other people? And then that got synced up with a kind of marketing and business communications, et cetera. And eventually they've been going together ever since. Like, how do we, so I cannot imagine that I will ever tire of trying to figure out or improve the basic question of how do we accelerate the understanding and adoption of new ideas, particularly in service of transformational and long-term change. Because it has been a bright line from like, panic attack at 17 all the way through. Even as much as my career has gone like this just everything can lines up with that as just a core question of my life. I do not see myself as somebody who ever stops pursuing something around that. And I still love like talking to people about their ideas. I love helping them figure it out because, there's nothing more energizing for me than to see somebody who is energized about their own idea. And when they realize that there's something getting in the way of that, of what they see getting out there, when we can solve that together, like that's just to just see people light up for that is just, I love that. So I know that, like, I don't understand, like, I don't understand how people stop working. I don't, not from a, like, I mean, I do from a practical standpoint, but from a motivation standpoint, I'm like, I don't want that. I love this. But the format, I fully admit and would be open to change, right? So I would be very happy. I mean, what I want to, if I'm going to leave a legacy in this world, what I'd love to do is, to the extent that I can, is to create the field and practice of persuasive message design. It's a whole in adult education, it's a whole in business messaging, it's a whole in life. It's crazy to me that lawyers aren't taught it, like business school students aren't taught it. Professors aren't taught it, right? Unless you're like somehow came up through education, but it's like we all have to do this and nobody's taught it. And
Mhm.
so I really want to create a field of teaching it, right? So if I can do that, I don't care if it's a standalone commercialized institute, if it gets bought by some other aligned organization, or if it gets brought into an academic scenario. I don't know. I could easily see myself going into academia at some point, though I would really only want to do it as what's known as a professor of practice, whose job is to translate the research of the organization out into the real world, because that's kind of what I do, just from the other side. So I don't. Yeah, this isn't. I hope this is just the beginning of this phase, and not the end.
Fair enough. Um, I just have one more question, but it's the idea of, I think, communication and language,
Mhm.
um, and how people learn generationally, right?
Mhm.
Think
Yeah.
about, I think about like, Gen Z and onwards, and
Mhm.
the way, I don't know, even now, like I feel like there's be if you ever spend time around them, it's like it's a different, it's almost like a they're I tend to think about, like, on a very human level, what people need, right? Like,
Yeah.
what is the hierarchy of needs? How do you communicate those different things to different generations? And I think the way that people digest it is also going to be different generationally. And there's a curiosity around how these younger generations and then the future ones are going to be looking at some of the things that you're talking about.
Mm.
Um, I think it's gonna probably be even more of a priority, but the way that's the medium in which that's communicated to them will change drastically of, like, how
Dramatically.
they
Yeah.
understand that to be a priority, and then let alone how do they create change once they understand it's a priority. Do you ever think
Yeah.
about that? Does that kind of stuff keep you up?
Yeah. It doesn't keep me up at night. Yeah. But only with excitement, right? I'm trying to figure it out. I mean, it when you're when as somebody who originally started in marketing, if you think about the evolution just in all the channel development and whatever in the 25 plus years that I've been in marketing, it didn't take me long to go, I cannot keep up with all those channels. So let me focus on the things that don't change about people. And that's, and thankfully that aligned with, okay, well, how is it that somebody decides to make a different, where does motivation come from, and how does decision making work, and what, why storytelling, and all of these related topics. Um, and I am currently very interested in the power dynamics that are locked up in language. That's hard not to be when you go into academia, and so many of these great ideas are locked up in language that only people with an equivalent level of education oftentimes could even understand it.
Mm,
um, which seems a little backwards to me. Um, love them. I mean, I love academia, but I feel like I mean, I'm not kidding when I call myself an English to English translator. Um, so I think that I'm not much of a prediction engine, but I have two alpha kids, like two generation alpha kids. They're 14 and 16. And what I observe is consistent with what a lot of adult learning theory already knows, right? So I think what we're going to see is a couple things. One, a big shift to informal, self-directed, and what's known as incidental learning, right? Where you just learn something, you end up learning something because you need to, you're trying to figure out a thing in the moment, right? So you do a lot of this own, let me go figure out what's out there. Oh, I'm interested in this, or, oh, I need to know how to do this in order to be able to solve something. I was, this past week, I spent, I was at a conference with a woman I've known for a while now who built an entire house with her 4 kids, all under like 10 at the time, just from watching YouTube videos, right? So I think I think we're going to see a lot more of that. And I think we're going to see a lot more desire for, education that allows people to create the path if that's what they want, or to follow a path, or to modify a path. And so these are some of the things that I'm trying to build into how we're thinking about the Message Design Institute from the beginning, which is, I want there to be a variety of free resources. I want there to be recommended learning journeys. I want there to be places where we can say, if you're trying to get to this level, here are the things that we recommend. But also allow for almost algorithmic suggestions of, oh, you were interested in this, you might be interested in this other thing over here, just to allow people to follow that. So I think that there's going to be that movement to, like I said, to adult and workplace learning. I think the format of it's going to need to be a lot more self-directed, or allow for a lot more self-direction, and for people to follow where they want to go. And then I'd like to think that that's going to allow the pendulum to swing back to some of the more traditional markers of quality information. And that doesn't just necessarily have to be from academics, but I really think that that's a movement as well, right? Because, if we're thinking about the education system, increasingly people questioning the value of that and where it comes from, I just think there's going to be an enormous need for people to understand how to educate other adults, even if you're not officially an adult educator, just because it's going to be necessary, whether you're trying to help your team member or you're trying to introduce something new to the marketplace. I just think these are a set of skills that people are going to be very much in demand. And that, at least from my perspective, I think there's a lot of opportunity. Let's frame it that way. I don't see a lot of solutions out there for it. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for quality solutions to come and step in.
Got it. Well, I want to say thank you so much for taking the time. That was a
My
great way to,
pleasure.
a lot of great nuggets.
Absolutely.
But yeah, thank you so much for carving out the time for us.
Absolutely. My pleasure. Thanks so much, Chris.
Of course.